Hello and welcome to this lecture on children's literature and the Lake District, part of this University of Cumbria series of lectures, Changing Perceptions of a Cultural Landscape. My name is Danny Rurlander and I'm the author of Spilak, an action-adventure novel for children set in the Lake District. Spilak's publisher, in case you haven't read it, describes it like this: a thrilling novel about a group of brave kids and a bunch of homemade drones. A perfect adventure of the absolutely classic kind. Think Swallows and Amazons brought bang up to date. That's Barry Cunningham. In terms of style, one reviewer described my book as something of a cross between James Bond, Alex Rider and Wallace and Gromit, something I took as a bit of a compliment. I know some of you have read Spilak already, and some of the MA students at the University of Cumbria have been researching my book as part of a module on children's literature and the Lake District. And I'm thrilled that Spilak is going to appear on the reading syllabus for the MA English Literature course, Children's Literature in the Lake District, next year. As a local author, I'm particularly thankful for this opportunity. And I want to say thank you to Penelope Bradshaw of the University of Cumbria for inviting me to give this lecture. I think I'm particularly excited to be giving this talk as a children's author. I think it's true that we live in a time where childhood is under attack in various ways through the pressures of social media and exam pressures at school, perhaps the over-sexualisation of children and anxiety and all of those things. And I think in that context, it's more important than ever, isn't it, that we give children solid, rich, powerful, positive stories to read. And if you're an adult, you play a part in that, because adults are the gatekeepers of what children read. As W.H. Auden says, there are good books which are only for adults because their comprehension presupposes adult experience, but there are no good books which are only for children. In other words, if you find yourself ordering a couple of copies of Spilak for your children or grandchildren, available at all good bookshops of course, then why not buy an extra copy for yourself as well? And I'll do my best not to spoil the plot too much in what follows. Well, plug over. Let me tell you a little bit more about my ambition for this book when I set out to write it. My ambition for the novel was to write a cracking thriller, something of the Alex Rider pace, but perhaps with a little bit more heart in terms of emotional content and theme. And I deliberately wanted to cast a respectful nod back to my forebears, children's authors who wrote in or about the Lake District, particularly Arthur Ransome, who I had loved reading as a child, but who seems increasingly dated to modern children. And I particularly wanted to address something which I feel is often out of place in children's literature, and that is a sense of place. Well, whether or not I've achieved those aims, the reader can be the judge, but those were the aims I set out to achieve. In this talk then, in the context of changing perceptions of a cultural landscape, I'm going to focus on three areas. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the things that influenced me to write this story in the first place, especially that wonderful heritage of children's literature in the Lake District that we enjoy in this part of the world. Second, I'm going to talk about the setting, this wonderful place, particularly the southern lakes, that plays such an important part in the book. And I'm going to talk about how I created a fictional world from the solid reality that many of you know and love so well. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about briefly is the place of technology in the book and how the use of technology in the story offers a whole new perspective on that landscape. Whenever I visit schools, the question I'm asked most often is what influenced you or inspired you to write the story? And I always tell them three things. Firstly, like with any author, the books that I read as a child. For example, I loved the series of Tintin books by Hergé. One of the things that I loved about these books was that the places where the stories are set are real places, and I felt every page that I read I was learning something about the real world. And I think children love that, and particularly boys love that. They love facts and concrete places. Secondly, I really enjoyed Roald Dahl. He might not be to everyone's taste, and sometimes parents can be suspicious of his slightly anti-authoritarian bent, but I really enjoyed the Roald Dahl stories for two reasons. Firstly, his deceptively simple but incredibly powerful stories, and secondly, because he sort of stretched the bounds of language to the limits, and I love that. And then thirdly, of course, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Who could not be entranced by the idea of a ring that makes the wearer invisible? Really mind-bending stuff. However, if you're going to write a children's story set in the Lake District, you are, of course, standing on the shoulders of two great authors, whether you realise it or not. Firstly, Beatrix Potter, and secondly, Arthur Ransome. In some ways, Potter and Ransome are very different. She was the privileged daughter of wealthy Victorians. She wrote about animals, and she ended up a farmer conservationist. Ransome, on the other hand, was a well-travelled journalist who wrote about children and married Leon Trotsky's personal secretary, lived in many different houses, never seemed to be settled in one place, and he had no particular interest in preserving the land about which he wrote. But they did have two things in common. First, to one degree or another, while neither of them were native to the lakes, both Potter and Ransome very much placed their stories in the setting, the real-world setting of the English Lake District. And secondly, both of their fictional worlds were influenced hugely by childhood holidays in the Lake District. And I guess both of those factors have influenced my own writing as well. Beatrix Potter, as I'm sure is well known, had many family holidays in the Lake District as a child, her London-based family renting enormous houses for long periods of time over the summer, including Holherd near Troutbeck Bridge, Lingholm on Derwentwater, and of course the enormous pile of Ray Castle, which also features in my book. And it was thanks to these holidays that she fell in love with the Lake District, and the result, as we all know, were the 23 tiny little illustrated books about animals, most famously and perhaps never surpassed by Peter Rabbit. Well, while the setting for some of these books is quite generic, if you look closely, you can actually see very clear evidence of the particularity of the place that she wanted to capture. For example, the lake that the squirrels are rafting across on in Squirrel Nutkin is very obviously Derwentwater. In the opening picture of The Tale of Tom Kitten, you can actually see a very recognisable hilltop at Sorey. And Jeremy Fisher is set on Esthwaite Water, which was Beatrix Potter's favourite lake, of course. There are many other examples, and what seems to be the case is that the longer she lived in the Lake District and the more she wrote, the more particular the places became. It was as if she felt a growing affection for the Lake District, perhaps a growing confidence that was expressed in her drawings. Beatrix Potter's relationship with the landscape, of course, went well beyond her books. Her books made her vast amounts of money, as did the merchandise that she created to go with them. And with that money, as is well known, she bought up vast tracts of land in the Lake District and became very active in both its farming and conservation, eventually leaving thousands of acres to the National Trust when she died. Ironically, the more involved she became in the farming that her books paid for, the less and less interested she became in writing books for children. And then eventually she gave up writing them altogether. Well, what about Arthur Ransome? Here is my very battered copy of Swallow's Amazons. I think this was the one I read as a child, but I certainly read it to my children more recently. And Arthur Ransome also gained his love of the Lake District from family holidays, and he credits that experience for his inspiration behind Swallows and Amazons. He says, "I've often been asked how I came to write Swallows and Amazons. The answer is that it had its beginnings long, long ago when, as children, my brother, my sisters and I spent most of our holidays on a farm at the south end of Coniston. We played on or in the lake or on the hills about it, finding friends in the farmers and shepherds and charcoal burners, whose smoke rose from the coppice woods along the shore." No wonder that 5 of his 12 children's books are set in the Lake District, the others set in the Norfolk Broads or the Caribbean or the Suffolk coast or 1 or 2 other places. But Arthur Ransome's relationship to the landscape and geography of the Lake District is slightly more complicated than Beatrix Potter, and is slightly controversial as well, sometimes contradictory, and has been the subject of a number of books. The question really revolves around the extent to which he attempted to capture and place his adventures in real, recognisable settings. In his standard reply to the many child readers who would write to ask him to spill the beans about the locations of the book, he said this: "The only way to keep a secret is never to answer a question. All the places in the books are to be found, but not arranged quite as in the ordnance maps." On the other hand, when he was too sick to enter into correspondence, his wife, Evgenia, replied to one such inquiry by explaining that the Lake District is the background for the Swallows and Amazons stories, but, and I quote, "You will not be able to find exact spots, though you will find coves, bays and promontories closely enough resembling those described in the books if you drift along the shores in a boat." So there is some ambiguity about the relationship between the story and the exact location. Nowhere is this ambiguity more apparent than in the map, which you will find at the beginning of Swallows and Amazons. There is also, interestingly, an inverted version of this map in Swallowdale. The unnamed lake seems to be a combination of Windermere and Coniston. At first sight, if you know Windermere, it resembles Windermere more closely. Near the middle of the lake is a long island, which Ransome called Long Island. It is, of course, Belle Isle. And it is very close to a village which resembles Bowness, which he called Rio. But the main action in Swallows Amazons, of course, occurs on Wildcat Island, which seems to be an amalgamation of Peel Island on Coniston and Blakeholme on Windermere. And the reason for this, which Ransome himself explained, is because there was no island on Windermere that had such a good harbour as that wonderful hidden harbour on Wildcat Island. Meanwhile, the mountain of Cantenjunga, which the children climb in Swallowdale, is based on Coniston Old Man, and Captain Flint's houseboat is in fact the steam yacht gondola, or was based on the steam yacht gondola, I should say, which is now operated by the National Trust on Coniston. The second slightly distinctive feature of Arthur Ransome's relationship to the landscape is that, unlike Wordsworth and others before him and his contemporary Beatrix Potter, he wasn't a conservationist as such. He didn't even really try and showcase the beauty of the landscape. Instead, he used it as a setting for adventure. That classic adventure, or the kind that has become a classic, where children are free of adult supervision, free to explore and roam and use their imaginations and get up to all sorts of exciting things, pitting themselves against danger and adversary and coming out wiser from the experience. What I think is particularly interesting and endearing about Swallows and Amazons stories, though, is the way Ransome creates those adventures, which are mostly fairly tame by any standards, partly through the children's own imaginations. Their own thirst for adventure leads to their own fictionalising. Apart from the danger of drowning like duffers before they end the holiday, the only real adversity in Swallows and Amazons is the imagined adversity of the Blackett girls and Captain Flint, who of course all become firm friends by the end. So the story is really told in that marginal space between fantasy and reality, a place where dangers certainly lurk, but those dangers are thrilling more than threatening. This is exactly how Ransome describes the intention of the book. In How Swallows and Amazons Came to be Written, he says he was enjoying writing the book so much because of the way in which the children in it have no firm dividing line between make-believe and reality, but slip in and out of one and the other again and again. And I wonder if this is why, despite the fact that inevitably the books feel dated now, with their upper middle class children and public school heartiness, why 90 years after they were written, all 12 of Ransome's books are still on sale and selling well around the world. Well, there are many ways that I wanted to forge a new path through this well-trodden landscape with Spilak, but I also wanted to respectfully acknowledge the past and the heritage of Swallows and Amazons. And if you've read Swallows and Amazons, and if you read Spilak, you may well enjoy spotting some of those connections. For example, Swallows and Amazons is explicitly mentioned a couple of times by Maggie Green, one of the point of view characters in the book, who is on her own quest for a Ransome-esque adventure on holiday. The island of Thompson Home, which is a key setting in the book, is renamed Ransome Home, and there is of course a boat called Swallow. And beady-eyed Ransome fans will enjoy spotting many more subtle and deliberate allusions throughout the books. The second influence on me in writing the story are my own childhood adventures in the Lake District. I was privileged to grow up in Kendal, where my parents moved specifically so they could be close to the Lake District when I was age 7. But unlike the slightly well-to-do Walker and Blackett children, we were not well off, and yet I longed to get a taste of the adventure that I saw beckoning in those hills and lakes. Fortunately, one thing my parents did share with those families was a completely relaxed approach to what we might now call health and safety. There was, of course, no mobile phone, no GPS tracking device, none of the security blankets that we now rely on, even when we do let our children out of our sight. And yet my brother and I were literally free to roam wherever we wanted to. We swam the lakes, we explored the rivers and the creeks, we camped, we fished, and most of all, we lit fires at will. And there was a certain unself-consciousness about this, as anybody my age may remember. Whereas people today say they are wild camping or wild swimming, we just called it camping and swimming. That's what we did. But after a while, I wanted to get closer to the water, in particular Lake Windermere, which had always fascinated me since reading Swallows and Amazons and the other stories. And I thought then, and I think now, that Windermere, although it might not be everybody's favourite lake, and it's certainly been colonised by private ownership around the shores, it is also, I think, the most interesting lake, with its gentle hills, its little secret wooded islands, its grand homes, and of course its history, and most of all, its enormity, which to an 11-year-old boy swimming or canoeing is like an ocean. So I saved up my paper round money, and about age 13 I bought a 12-foot wooden sailing dinghy from the classified adverts in the Westland Gazette. And from that time on, a whole world of adventure opened up to me, including camping on the very islands that would later form part of the backdrop to my novel. When I go into schools to talk about my book, I like to tell the story of the day my mum, when I was about 14 or 15, dropped me at the lake to go for a day on the lake. I think it was in January, and she went off to teach at the lake school. I guess it must have been an inset day. I don't think I was just taking a day off. And there I was on the lake on my own on a cold, windy winter's day. No mobile phone, none of those kind of things. And I stumbled upon a black shape in the water near the shore, near a place called Millerground. Investigated the black shape, thought it was a bag of rubbish or something, prodded it with a stick, and realised to my horror that it was actually a dead body. And it turned out that it was a man who was missing and he'd drowned in the lake, and I'd stumbled across him. That story gets a lot of questions at the Q&A in every school visit I do. I also tell them stories about when I crashed a boat, when I was becalmed, about some arguments I had with charboat fishermen, about when a boat nearly sank, about when I had to swim to the shore because I'd forgotten my oars, and of course about the mysterious creature that lives under the lake called Bow Nessie. Well, I think either swimming or canoeing or sailing, I think I explored every corner of the lake, every creek and crevice at some point. And there were certain times of the year when I had the whole lake to myself, just me and the occasional hardy char fisherman. And when I had children of my own, I encouraged them to love the lakes as well. And it was camping with my own children by the shores of Lake Windermere that the story of Spilak began to take shape in my mind. I remember a particular day, probably around 4 years before the book was finally accepted for publication, that my son and I were camping by Lake Windermere. We were watching the setting sun lighting up the bracken in an orange glow on a horseshoe of fells at the north end of the lake. The blue sky studded with a few stars, bats flitting through the trees. And I knew at that moment that this was the setting for a classic adventure story with a modern twist that I wanted to tell. Not only that, but I could see in my mind a scene involving a triangle of hills, which would become a particularly crucial scene in the book. In fact, it became the foundation for the whole book. Well, I've talked about the stories I read as a child. I've talked about some of the adventures I had growing up in the lakes. But there's one more influence behind this story, and that is flying. One thing you get used to in the Lake District is the sound of tornadoes roaring through the valleys as RAF pilots practice their low-level flying, at least on a Monday to Friday. I guess that may have been one of the reasons why I jumped at the chance to learn to fly with the RAF in my university air squadron. Once a week for a full day for 2 years, I went down to the airfield and had flying lessons with the Royal Air Force as an officer cadet, and it was fantastic. We flew in a little single propeller two-seater plane called a Bulldog. Within 5 hours of instruction we were flying solo. Within 10 hours or so we were doing aerobatics. I flew in Germany, in the USA, and had a wonderful time and clocked up around about 50 hours of flying experience. But the best thing about flying is the perspective that it gives you on the landscape. It's what one of the characters in the book, Jim Rothwell, who is Tom's mentor character, refers to as the extraordinary privilege of flight. And what he means by that is that from the air you can see the landscape in a whole new perspective, in that bird's eye perspective. You can notice things, patterns and arrangements and relationships that it's impossible to see from the ground. From the air, ordinary things take on a different perspective. And this gives flying real narrative potential, particularly in an action-adventure children's book. There is, of course, just one problem, and that is that 13-year-old boys don't usually fly aeroplanes. So my solution was to employ drones. And I'll tell you a little bit more about these a little bit later on. But first, let me read you a little extract from the book. Keeping the church tower between himself and the hillside, he was setting a bearing for home when something airborne loomed past, eclipsing the light for a second. With a twist of the controls, Tom spiralled skywards, spun back and found himself staring with horror into the windshield of a helicopter. The sight of it filling the screen made his stomach churn. It was a hefty, military-type, menacing air intake's bulbous nose. He could see Skylark's reflection in the pilot's helmet visor, like a moth in the eye of a hawk. He saw a gloved hand point at him, and felt the slap of turbulence as the aircraft pitched towards him. Tom sped away, chased like a leaf by the wind. He twisted the throttle and watched the airspeed indicator surge, 30 knots, 40, 45, 50. Through the controls, he felt a bone-deep tremor in his fingers as the drone was bounced and buffeted on a cushion of air. He was over the lake now and still accelerating, 60 knots, 65. Any faster and Skylark's wings would come off or the motors would burn out. His only chance to outmaneuver the helicopter was to flip up and over into a tight loop, ending up in its blind spot, and then take refuge somewhere low before he could be found again, if he were fast enough. He searched for somewhere to land. In the middle of the wide basin opposite Douthwaite Bay, he spotted a long wooden rowing boat with a grey-haired man attending to one of the rods that were fixed on either side of the boat. He couldn't see the man's face, but he was sure it was Jim Rothwell. When he came close enough to read the name of the boat, Swallow, painted on her side in yellow letters, Tom exhaled with relief and decided to drop into the boat and hide until the helicopter had gone. He took a deep breath, put both hands on the control stick to steady himself, but when he pulled back, bracing himself for the sudden glare of sky and then the inverted horizon of the loop, nothing happened. He wiggled the stick sharply, but Skylark kept flying steadily towards the shore, and he knew the drone's control signals had been jammed.
Okay. That wasn't good. Just keep walking. Okay, you can just keep walking.
Oh, you can.
Keep going. Look forward.
Let me turn now to the second thing I would like to talk to you about, and that is the setting. As I said, one of my aims for the book was for the setting to be more than an incidental backdrop to the plot, but I wanted to create an unforgettable real-world arena in which the characters live and act. I wanted to try and capture this wonderful place that we know and love so well in such a way that you could smell the scent of bracken coming off the hills in the very pages. All of the action in the book is set in, on, around or above that northern end of Lake Windermere and the surrounding fells and rivers. And I set myself the goal of specificity. I wanted pretty much every place mentioned in the book to be somewhere that you could actually go and find in the real world if you wanted to. Even if in one or two cases, like Arthur Ransome, the places were slightly disconnected from the Ordnance Survey maps, but only in a few cases. If you've read the book, you'll know how vital both the landscape and the geography of the place is to the story. It was very important that the locations helped the reader to make sense of what was happening. And this took a fair amount of research. Some of the real places in the book, for example, are Tom's house, which is a real house that I've admired for years, on the confluence of the Brathay and the Rothay. The island, Thompson Home, where the children camp, which is the island that I used to camp on. The roads, the woods, the paths, the streams, the farm, the church that was mentioned in that reading is the church at Brathay, and so on. So this took a fair amount of research. always beginning, of course, with a 1 to 25,000 Ordnance Survey map. And then, having plotted everything on the map, worked out where everything took place, I then asked the illustrator, Finn Sorsby, to create a map that was a proper map to scale, but represented the fictional world of Spilak. And the result is the map that you'll see in the front of the book, which orientates the reader to all the places. There's Ray Castle, for example. There's Tom's house, the River Brathay and Rothay, the head of the lake, the steamer Teal, and so on and so forth, and Belle Isle down there. It might be this strong connection to such a globally loved region that is one of the reasons that Spilak has been published, or is about to be published, in China. And here is a brief video that I put together for the Chinese publisher to promote the book. Well, I've just walked up one of the beautiful Lake District hills, because key to the story in the book are 3 hilltops, 3 peaks, and they're all on the map in the front of the book. There is Rignot, which is just behind me, Ravenhow, which is just over there, and Brockbarrow, which is where I am now. And from here you can see the lake and the islands, and it's in this area that the whole adventure happens. I hope you really enjoy all the food that is mentioned in the book. There's quite a lot of it, including this famous local delicacy called Kendal mink cake that's made not far away from here. It's a food that's full of energy because it's mainly made of sugar. It was even taken up Mount Everest by Edmund Hillary. And I'm going to have a little bit now before I go down. Another food that you might see in the book is Grasmere Gingerbread, which has been made here in Grasmere to a secret recipe and nowhere else in the world since 1854. And I think it's delicious. When I wrote Spilak, I really wanted to try and capture this wonderful place, the English Lake District. And it might just inspire you to come for a visit. I hope that you can do. And if you ever do, there are plenty of things to do here. You can walk on these beautiful fells and see the lakes and enjoy all the wonderful scenery. You could go to see the swans in Bowness. You could get a boat trip on the lake on one of the many boats that operate throughout the year. You could go for an explore on an open top bus. You could call in and see the famous Bridge House in Ambleside, one of the smallest houses in England. And one place you must go is Grasmere. There you'll see where the famous English poet Wordsworth lived and is buried, and you'll get to taste the delicious Grasmere gingerbread. There's quite a lot of food in the book, but the thing that Tom Hopkins, the main character in Spilak, likes more than anything in the world is a hot bacon sandwich cooked over an open fire in the great outdoors. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm thrilled Spilak is coming to China, and I really hope you enjoy the story. Delicious. I hope you also enjoyed references to local food in that video, which are scattered throughout the book as well. And children have told me that they love that. But also in that video, I mentioned the 3 peaks, which are Ravenhow, Brockbarrow and Rigknot. These are key, without giving the plot away, to the action of the story. In the Arthur Ransome tradition, I've changed the names, but if you know the area, you'll be able to work out what those peaks are. And if you're really interested, there are 3 walks on my website which will take you for a lovely walk up each of those 3 peaks with things to spot from the book as well. And if anybody completes all 3 walks and emails me, I will be very happy to send you a certificate to say that you've done it. Well, let's dig down a little bit further into the theme of the setting. And there are 2 features of the story that I think worth exploring further. And I guess you could say these are both archetypal features of many children's books. Islands and tunnels. Islands, first of all. There are, as Joel Green, the character in the book who loves maps and exploring, points out, 19 named islands on Lake Windermere. These islands that you can see on a large-scale map of Windermere are not the little tufts of rock that don't have a name, but each of them has a name and a story all of their own. In my school visits, I like to ask children to think about how many books that there are that feature islands in them, and to ask why. So you might think, for example, of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe as perhaps the most famous one. But then there is also Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, William Shakespeare's The Tempest. What about C.S. Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Michael Morpurgo's Kensky's Kingdom, and more recently, The Girl of Ink and Stars by Kieran Millwood Hargrave and The Stormkeeper's Island by Catherine Doyle. Why are there so many islands in children's books? Well, the answer, of course, as Maggie Green, Joel's more romantic sister, explains, is that an island isn't just a piece of rock. It's an idea, a miniature kingdom, our own little secret world. Now, one of the islands that I was long fascinated by is Belle Isle, right in the middle of Lake Windermere, that biggest of the islands that Ransome called Long Island. I was fascinated by it probably because I could never get to it. It's been privately owned for somewhere in the region of 400 years, most of that time by the same family. And when I was growing up and pottering around, there were signs up saying, "Keep off, guard dogs." And once or twice, I think I did see, or perhaps imagine seeing, a Rottweiler or 2 guarding the shore. And it occurred to me when I was researching this that not only have I never stepped foot on that island, but I don't know anybody else who has. And so the secret for me was Google Earth and a little bit of research in books. But for the children in the book, all they had to do, of course, was fly their drone over the island. The second, more unusual landscape feature that I exploited in the book is the tunnel. And the particular tunnel is the Thirlmere Aqueduct. If you turn on the tap in Manchester, chances are that out comes clean, soft, fresh water that has come all the way down the Thirlmere Aqueduct from the Lake District hills and the Thirlmere Reservoir. And in the book, this aqueduct not only is an interesting feature because it's 100 miles long, it was dug out by the Victorian engineers in a massive feat of engineering to carry the water from the Lake District down to Manchester in a descent of 230 feet, a fall of just 20 inches to the mile, which means the water takes 3 miles an hour by gravity alone, taking just over a day to reach Manchester. Not only is it all of those things, but this Thirlmere Aqueduct is also a key part of the plot, and it's also a key part of the main character's emotional journey as well. Well, let me give you another extract from the book. Tom waded back to the beach with his rucksack, pulled out a 9-inch tablet and slumped onto the pebbles. He opened the screen and typed in a code to activate Skylark's automatic launch and locate function, a feature he had tested a few times but never needed to use before. It took a few seconds for the computer in the workshop back home to lock onto his position. Then the launch icon on the tablet began to blink red while the flight parameters were calculated. Behind him he could hear Maggie shouting for Joel to gather their things. The icon turned orange and the details of the flight path the autopilot would follow to get to Tom appeared on the screen. 4.5 miles at 40 knots, adjusted for the strong headwind that was blowing up the lake, would give a flight time of 6 minutes and 20 seconds. He tapped the screen and the launch icon turned green just as Maggie and Joel arrived back at the beach. They're worse than animals, those boys. Maggie was untying the painter. Yeah, pretty much, but I'm trying to tell you that it doesn't matter because I can find Snakey from here. How? Look. They followed his gaze past the overhanging branches, where Skylark now appeared, a speck of black high in the greying sky, like a long-haul jet on its final descent from some distant land. The drone passed overhead, banked around and settled into a bumpy approach towards them. This is Skylark. Spilak, more like. Maggie crouched on the pebbles and watched him guardedly. Watch the screen. Tom deactivated the autopilot and took control, sending the drone spiralling up to 400 feet. Maggie and Joel bent their heads over the tablet. They could see the whole island, boats passing on either side, their wash spreading out far behind, treetops like lichen, and 3 people standing on the beach with their heads bent over a screen. Now that's what I call a selfie, said Joel. Come on, said Maggie, let's follow them. I don't suppose that thing has any weapons attached. No, said Tom. Who does she think she is, he thought. James Bond? They watched the screen as Tom circled higher and Benson Isle came into view. At the southern end sat the grand round house, concealed from the lake by enormous Douglas firs and monkey puzzle trees. A path led away from the house over a neat lawn, past a tennis court, to a clearing where the helicopter was parked. The pilot was pacing up and down the grass, but no one else was around. Spilak opens with 13-year-old Tom Hopkins winging his homemade drone over the Lake District hills as he's hurrying home for school. And in the process, from that aerial vantage point, he sees things that other people miss. From that privileged bird's eye perspective of flight, he notices a pattern, and that leads him to solve a bit of a riddle. And that leads him into the world of international terrorism and the adventure that ensues. This opening scene then orientates the reader to the particular narrative device that I was interested in exploring in the book. While Tom soars over the peaks and islands of the Lake District, the reader soars with him, and we see the classic Swallows and Amazons landscape from a whole new perspective. But what really excited me about this technology is the particular, and I think perhaps unique narrative device of allowing the character and the reader through the character's point of view of being in 2 places at once. Because of course, while Tom is seeing the landscape from this bird's eye point of view, he is bodily remaining in his shed at the bottom of the garden. You can do this, of course, other ways. You can be in 2 places at once through fantasy, through magic, through science fiction, or simply through an omniscient narrator. But I thought this was something a bit different, something new that was worth exploring. To do all of that action in the real world from a single character's point of view, that is what drones enable you to do. Well, I took my vastly inferior drone to Tom's to Loughrick to give you a taste of what this technology can do. So that was a great flight. Up there we could see the lake from a whole different point of view. And now our drone is going to land itself perfectly.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, that was a success, wasn't it?
yeah.
Well, there's one final piece of information, only gradually revealed to the reader in the book, that makes this ability of Tom's to fly of paramount importance. And that is that the main character, Tom, by naturally a physically adventurous and outdoor-loving character, has suffered a horrific accident a little while before the story opens and is now disabled and walks with a severe limp with the help of a stick. So his flying helps him overcome his mobility issues, and it also serves as a kind of an escape. It does, of course, in terms of the story, enable him to catch the criminals and end up as the hero in the best tradition of the genre. But the flying is also connected to his inner emotional journey as he faces up to the scars and pains of the past. If there is a lesson to be learned from the adventure, it's that it will take more than just machines to heal this internal damage before the story can come to an end. Part, but only a part of that healing, is mediated via the landscape itself. The very landscape that has been so threatening and dangerous is at the same time the means by which Tom must learn that he is a small part of something bigger. The Lake District has changed since Arthur Ransome and Beatrix Potter first fell in love with it. Even more, our perception of this landscape has changed with each successive generation of art and literature that attempts to represent it. But one thing that has not changed is the capacity of this unique landscape to inspire adventure and story that lasts well beyond the teller.